The train hissed to a stop, a great sigh of steam and iron that seemed to drain the last bit of courage from Corinne's body. She stood, her legs stiff from the long journey, and clutched the worn handle of her satchel. This was it. Promise, the sign had read, a name so full of hope it felt like a mockery. Through the grimy window, the town was little more than a single dusty street squinting under a vast, unforgiving sky. There was no promise here, only the end of the line. The ticket she had bought with the gold and sapphire ring, the last piece of a life that no longer belonged to her, had carried her this far and no farther. She stepped down onto the splintered platform, and the heat hit her like a physical blow. It was a dry, baking heat that smelled of dust, horse manure, and something wild, like sun-scorched sage. The few people milling about the station turned to look. Their gazes were not friendly. They slid over her dark traveling dress, respectable but too warm for this place, and the fine-boned weariness in her face. She was an outsider, a stray, and every pair of eyes told her she did not belong. She kept her chin high, a habit born of a lifetime of pretending she was not about to shatter into 1,000 pieces. Her shoes, made for cobblestone streets and polished floors, were thin and useless against the grit that worked its way through the seams. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and what little she could fit in the satchel, a change of linen, a hairbrush, and a small hollowed-out book where she'd hidden the few dollars she had left. It was not enough. It would never be enough. She had traded her future for a ticket west, and now she stood at the destination with no map for what came next. A man strode past her, his presence a disruption in the thick, slow-moving air. He was tall, built of lean muscle and leather, with shoulders that blocked out the sun for a moment. He wore a dusty hat pulled low, but she saw the hard line of his jaw and a face carved by sun and wind. He moved with a purpose that seemed to belong to the land itself, confident and unyielding. He did not look at her, his focus on a stack of crates being unloaded from the freight car. He was part of this place, rooted and strong, everything she was not. Her hands, slick with nervous sweat, fumbled with the clasp of her satchel. It sprang open unexpectedly, spilling a small portion of its meager contents onto the dusty platform. A small tin of hand salve, a ribbon, and the hollowed book skittered across the boards. A flush of shame burned her cheeks. She bent quickly to retrieve them, her movements clumsy with exhaustion and humiliation. A large, calloused hand reached down and picked up the book before she could. She froze, her eyes level with a pair of scuffed leather boots. Slowly, she looked up. It was the cowboy from before. He was closer now, and she could see the fine lines etched around his eyes, the color of a stormy sky. He held the book out to her, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am," he said. The word was not a question or a greeting. It was just a sound, rough as gravel, but not unkind. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice tight. She took the book, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was warm and rough, a startling solid touch that sent a strange tremor through her. For a heartbeat, his gaze dropped to her left hand, to the pale, naked circle of skin on her ring finger. He saw it. He saw the story she was trying to outrun. But his face showed nothing. No pity. No judgment. He simply nodded, a short, sharp dip of his head, then turned and walked toward his crates without another word. That was the moment. The moment everything changed. Not because he had offered help or charity, but because he had not. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, a woman unmoved at the edge of the world, and had treated her with a simple, solid decency that asked for nothing in return. He had seen her, truly seen her, and then let her be. In his quiet acknowledgement, she felt the first flicker of something other than fear. His name was Sullivan, though she did not know it then. She only knew the weight of his gaze and the startling fact that for the first time in months, she had not felt invisible. Promise had one hotel that was more of a boarding house, run by a woman named Mrs. Gable, whose face looked permanently puckered from sucking on a lemon. She looked Corinne up and down, her eyes lingering on the worn but well-made fabric of her dress. "No rooms for long term," she snapped, her voice as thin and sharp as a needle. "I'm looking for work," Corinne said, keeping her voice steady. "I can cook, I can clean, I can mend." Mrs. Gable gave a short, unpleasant laugh. "Everyone can do that. What I need is a laundress. Someone who isn't afraid of lye soap and boiling water. It's hard work. Backbreaking." She said it as a challenge, expecting Corinne to balk. "I'm not afraid of work," Corinne replied, meeting the woman's sour gaze. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. She was terrified of the work, of the failure, of this entire brutal place. But she was more terrified of the alternative. She got the job, if it could be called that. It came with a room in the attic, little more than a closet with a cot, where the summer heat pooled and suffocated. The pay was a pittance, barely enough for food after Mrs. Gable deducted her rent. The days became a blur of steam, sweat, and the raw, chapped skin of her hands. She washed the linens for the entire boarding house, the grimy shirts of traveling salesmen, the dusty clothes of ranch hands. Her body ached in ways she never knew it could, a deep, cellular exhaustion that sleep could not touch. But with the ache came a strange sort of numbness. In the punishing rhythm of the work, there was no time to think of the man she had fled or the life she had lost. The women of the town watched her with suspicion. They whispered behind their hands when she went to the mercantile for supplies. They saw her fine speech and the way she held herself, and it did not match the drudgery of her work. They decided she was hiding something, that she was a woman with a past, and in a town like Promise, a past was a dangerous thing for a woman to have alone. One afternoon, a commotion erupted in the main street. A horse, a beautiful and furious black mare, had thrown its rider and was now tearing through the town, wild-eyed and terrified. Men scrambled out of its way, shouting uselessly. The mare's leg was bleeding from a shallow gash where it had scraped against a hitching post, adding pain to her panic. Corinne was shaking out a heavy blanket from a second-story window of the boarding house when she saw it. She watched the men chase and holler, their frantic energy only making the animal more crazed. She saw the horse's heaving sides, the whites of its eyes, the way its ears were pinned back not just in anger, but in sheer terror. And she saw something else, the brand on its flank, a circle with 3 wavy lines running through it, like a creek. The brand of the man from the station. Without thinking, she dropped the blanket, ran down the stairs, and pushed through the screen door into the street. Mrs. Gable shrieked her name, but Corinne didn't hear her. The men yelled for her to get back, that she would be killed. She ignored them too. Her focus was entirely on the horse. Her father had taught her. Before the debts and the desperation, he had raised horses. He used to say that you don't break a horse's spirit, you ask for its trust. You speak its language, which is a language of stillness, not of noise. Corinne slowed her steps, softening her body, making herself smaller, less of a threat. She began to hum, a low, tuneless sound deep in her chest, the same sound she had used as a girl to soothe frightened foals. The mare saw her. It skittered sideways, nostrils flaring, ready to bolt again. But Corinne didn't stop. She kept walking, slow and steady, her eyes cast down, not meeting the horse's terrified gaze directly. She murmured to it in a low voice, "Easy now. Easy, girl. No one is going to hurt you." A hush fell over the street. The shouting men fell silent, watching in disbelief. Sullivan was there, having ridden in from the edge of town when he heard the news. He stood by the mercantile, stock still, watching the woman from the station approach his most volatile, untamable mare. He started to move, to call out, but one of his own men put a hand on his arm. "Wait, boss, look." Corinne was only a few feet away now. She held out a hand, palm down, and waited. The mare trembled, its skin twitching, but it did not run. It watched her, its dark, intelligent eyes filled with fear and a dawning curiosity. It took a hesitant step forward, then another, and stretched out its neck to sniff her outstretched fingers. Corinne remained perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs. Slowly, so slowly, she raised her other hand and gently touched the mare's neck. The horse flinched but did not pull away. She stroked the sleek, sweat-dampened coat, her voice a constant, soothing murmur. She examined the gash on its leg, her touch feather-light. It was clean, not deep. She eased closer, her shoulder pressing lightly against the horse's, a gesture of shared space, of trust. With one hand still stroking its neck, she reached for the trailing reins, her movements fluid and unhurried. The mare tossed its head once, then settled, letting out a long, shuddering breath. She had it. Corinne led the trembling horse toward the group of stunned men. She stopped in front of Sullivan, her gaze finally meeting his. The surprise in his stormy eyes was plain to see. He looked from her to his mare, now standing quietly at her side, and back again. He saw the raw, red skin of her hands, the hands of a laundress, holding the reins of a horse none of his experienced men could handle. "She's more scared than hurt," Corinne said, her voice quiet but clear. "The cut needs cleaning, but she'll be fine." Sullivan didn't speak for a long moment. He just looked at her, and in that look, the entire town of Promise seemed to fade away. He saw past the tired laundress, past the desperate woman at the station. He saw a strength and a hidden grace that took his breath away. He had offered her a moment of dignity on the platform that day. Now she was offering him a piece of his own wildness, gentled and returned to him. He took the reins from her hand, their fingers brushing again. This time, the touch lingered for a second too long. "I'm Sullivan," he said, his voice low. "Triple Creek Ranch." "Corinne," she replied. "You have a way with horses, Corinne." It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact, spoken with a sense of wonder. And in that moment, Corinne knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would not be washing sheets for Mrs. Gable for much longer. The offer came the next day. Sullivan appeared at the boarding house, his tall frame filling the doorway, making Mrs. Gable's cramped parlor seem even smaller. He didn't waste words. He needed someone to look after his horses, particularly the broodmares and the young stock. Someone with quiet hands. He offered her a position, a small cabin of her own on the ranch, and wages that made Mrs. Gable's eyes narrow with envy and spite. A woman? Working with horses on a ranch full of men? Mrs. Gable sniffed, crossing her arms. "It's not decent." Sullivan's gaze was cold as riverstone. "It's a job, Mrs. Gable. Decency doesn't come into it." He looked at Corinne. "Well?" She did not hesitate. "Yes," she said. "I accept." The Triple Creek Ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, a sprawling testament to Sullivan's hard work. A long, low ranch house sat on a rise overlooking corrals, barns, and pastures that stretched out like a green blanket. It was beautiful and intimidating. The ranch hands watched her arrive in Sullivan's wagon with the same suspicion as the townswomen, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. A woman's place was in the kitchen, not the stables. Her cabin was small and simple, but it was clean, and it was hers. It had a proper bed, a small stove, and a window that looked out onto a pasture of grazing mares. After the stifling attic, it felt like a palace. For the first time since leaving her old life behind, Corinne felt she could breathe. The work was hard, but it was a different kind of hard from the laundry. It was a good ache, the ache of muscles used for a purpose she understood. She spent her days with the horses, her quiet presence slowly becoming a familiar part of the barn's rhythm. The animals responded to her. The skittish ones calmed, the stubborn ones gentled. She learned their individual natures, their fears, and their comforts. In their silent, honest company, the raw edges of her own spirit began to heal. Sullivan kept his distance mostly. He was a man who seemed more comfortable with silence than with words. He would watch her from afar, his arms crossed over his chest as he leaned against a corral fence. He saw the way she moved, the patient, methodical way she cleaned a hoof or untangled a mane. He saw a competence that settled something in him. But he did not approach. He was a man who had built walls around himself, thick and high, and he was not yet ready to inspect the cracks she was making in them. One night, a late-season thunderstorm spooked a new colt. Its panicked whinnies and the sound of splintering wood woke Corinne. She pulled on her boots over her nightdress and ran to the barn, a lantern swinging in her hand. The colt was wild-eyed, crashing against the walls of its stall. Corinne didn't try to enter. She just stood outside the door, her lantern casting long, dancing shadows, and began to hum. The same low, steady sound she'd used on the mare in town. The barn door creaked open. Sullivan stood there, a rifle in one hand, his face taut with alarm. He saw her, saw the colt, and stopped. He watched as the young horse's panic slowly subsided, its frantic movements ceasing as it turned its head toward the sound of her voice. He lowered the rifle and walked toward her, his steps silent. He didn't speak, just stood beside her in the warm, sweet-smelling darkness of the barn. The only sounds were the rain drumming on the roof, the colt's soft snorts, and her quiet humming. After a long while, he left and returned with 2 tin mugs of coffee, black and strong. He handed one to her. Their fingers brushed in the dim light. "He lost his mother a week back," Sullivan said, his voice a low rumble. "He's been skittish ever since." "He's just lonely," Corinne murmured, not taking her eyes off the colt, who was now resting its head on the stall door, listening. They stood like that for nearly an hour, sharing a silence that was more comfortable than any conversation. He didn't ask about her past. She didn't ask about his. But in the quiet companionship of the stormy night, a silent understanding passed between them. He was a lonely man, and she was a lonely woman, and they were standing together in the dark, keeping a frightened creature safe. The slow burn of their connection was built on such moments. A few days later, he found her struggling to repair a section of fence that a stubborn bull had pushed through. He didn't take the tools from her, as another man might have. Instead, he came and worked alongside her, showing her the specific way he twisted the wire to hold it tight. "Like this," he said, his large hand covering hers to guide the movement. His touch was practical, meant only for instruction, but it sent a jolt of heat straight through her. Her breath caught in her throat. He must have felt it too, because he pulled his hand away abruptly, his expression shuttered and distant. He finished the rest of the fence in a tense, methodical silence and left without another word. His retreat confused her. There were times she would catch him looking at her, a strange, hungry expression in his eyes, a look of a man starving for something he dared not name. But the moment she met his gaze, the mask of the cold, capable rancher would slam back into place. She learned that he'd had a wife, years ago, who had died. The men didn't speak of it, and a child, too, but their silence on the matter was heavier than any story. She began to understand that his walls were not built of anger, but of grief. He was a man guarding a ruin. The final brick in their unspoken foundation was laid by a sudden, violent rainstorm that swept down from the mountains without warning. Corinne had been out in the far pasture, checking on the black mare who was due to foal any day. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the heavens opened up. Rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the dry ground to slick mud. The mare, spooked by the thunder, refused to be led back to the barn. Corinne was soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her face, fighting a losing battle with the terrified horse when Sullivan appeared out of the deluge, riding hard. He swung down from his horse and came to her side. "Get to the barn!" he yelled over the roar of the wind. "Not without her!" she yelled back, her grip tight on the mare's rope. He didn't argue. He just took the rope from her other hand and together, they fought the wind and the rain and the horse's panic, finally coaxing the animal into a stumbling run toward the shelter of the barn. Inside, they collapsed against the door, gasping for breath, water streaming from them onto the hay-strewn floor. He looked at her, at the rain dripping from her chin, the fierce determination in her eyes. He stripped off his heavy duster coat and wrapped it around her shivering shoulders. It was heavy and warm and smelled of him, of leather and rain and man. He was standing so close she could feel the heat of his body. He raised a hand and gently brushed a stray strand of wet hair from her cheek. His fingers were rough, but his touch was incredibly tender. His gaze dropped to her mouth. The air in the barn grew thick, charged with unspoken longing. He leaned in, his stormy eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't name. This was it. The moment the silence would break. But then a shout from outside. "Boss! The creek's rising! We need to move the lower herd!" The spell was shattered. Sullivan stiffened, stepping back as if burned. The wall was back, higher and stronger than ever. "See to the mare," he said, his voice clipped and businesslike. He turned and strode out into the storm, leaving her wrapped in the warmth of his coat, her heart aching with the ghost of a kiss that had never happened. He was terrified, she realized, not of the storm or the rising creek, but of her, of what she made him feel. A week later, a polished black buggy, entirely out of place in the dusty landscape of promise, pulled up in front of the mercantile. A man stepped out, dressed in a fine wool suit that was already wilting in the heat. He was handsome in a severe, clean-shaven way, with eyes the color of ice, and a mouth that looked as if it had never learned to smile. Corinne, in town for supplies, saw him and her blood ran cold. It was Mr. Albright, the man she was supposed to marry, the man whose ring she had traded for her freedom. He saw her at the same moment. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Corinne," he said, his voice smooth and possessive, "I knew I would find you. Did you really think you could run from me?" The townspeople stopped to watch, their curiosity piqued. This was far more interesting than the price of flour. Corinne stood frozen, the sack of beans in her hand suddenly weighing 1,000 pounds. "What are you doing here, Arthur?" she managed to say, her voice trembling slightly. "I've come to collect what is mine," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "My runaway fiancé, you caused your father a great deal of trouble, my dear, and me a great deal of expense." He held up his hand as if to silence an argument she hadn't made. "But I am a forgiving man. You will come back with me, and we will forget this unfortunate little adventure of yours." Mrs. Gable was standing on the porch of the boarding house, soaking it all in, her face alight with malicious glee. "I knew it," she hissed to the woman next to her. "I knew she was trouble." Corinne found her voice, a thread of steel weaving through the fear. "I am not your fiancé. I never was. It was an arrangement of my father's, one I never agreed to." Albright laughed, a cold, unpleasant sound. "An agreement is an agreement. You are promised to me. You left with a ring that belongs to my family." He was playing to the crowd now, painting her as a thief and a liar. Just then Sullivan rode into town, his face grim. He had heard the news of the fancy buggy and the Easterner asking questions. He swung down from his horse and walked to stand beside Corinne. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a solid wall at her back. Albright's eyes narrowed, taking in Sullivan's dusty clothes and the quiet authority with which he held himself. "And who is this? Your new protector?" He sneered. "I'm her employer," Sullivan said, his voice level and cold. "And this is my town. You have no business here." "She is my business," Albright retorted. He turned to Sullivan, dismissing Corinne completely. "Look, Cowboy, I'm sure she has made herself useful to you. I will compensate you for your trouble." He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather wallet. "Name your price for her contract." The insult hung in the air, thick and ugly. He was trying to buy her, like a horse or a piece of land. Corinne felt a wave of nausea. Sullivan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The silence stretched, taut and dangerous. The entire street seemed to be holding its breath. Sullivan had to make a choice. He could declare her nothing more than a hired hand and wash his hands of the whole affair, preserving his reputation and avoiding a fight that wasn't his. Or he could stand for her. The rational choice was to walk away. And for one terrifying moment, seeing the cold fury in his eyes, Corinne was afraid he would. The weight of what she had done crashed down on her. She had brought this trouble to his door, this ugliness from her past tainting the quiet sanctuary he had given her. She had seen the way the townspeople looked at her, the way Albright's words had cemented their suspicions. If she stayed, she would ruin Sullivan's standing in this community. He was a respected man, a man who had built everything he had from nothing. She could not let her past tear it down. That night, she made her decision. In the quiet of her small cabin, by the light of a single kerosene lamp, she packed her meager belongings back into the satchel. She had so little, yet it felt heavier than it had when she'd first arrived. She wrote a short note, her hand shaking. "Thank you for your kindness. I cannot let my trouble become yours." She left it on the small wooden table. She had no destination, no plan. She only knew she had to disappear before she destroyed the one good thing she had found in this harsh, unforgiving land. She slipped out of the cabin like a ghost, the sleeping ranch dark and silent around her. The moon was a sliver in the sky, offering little light. She would walk to the next town or catch a ride on a freight wagon. She would become a laundress again, or a seamstress, or whatever she had to be. She would survive. But as she walked down the long dirt track that led away from the Triple Creek, a profound and desolate sorrow settled over her. She was not just fleeing Albright now. She was fleeing the first place that had ever felt like home, and the man who had made it so. Sullivan found the note at dawn. He had woken with a sense of unease, a feeling that the world was off its axis. When he saw her cabin door slightly ajar, a cold dread seized him. He read the note, his jaw tightening until it ached. "My trouble." He crumpled the paper in his fist. He had spent years cultivating a life of quiet control, of emotional distance. He had convinced himself that the silence in his house was peace. But waking up to the knowledge that she was gone, he understood the truth. It was not peace. It was emptiness. An emptiness she had unknowingly and completely filled. The silence now was a roaring in his ears. He went into his house, the house his wife had never lived to make a home, the house where his son's laughter had never echoed. He stood in the middle of the cold, clean kitchen and was slammed by the force of his own loneliness. He had lost his family to a fever that swept through the territory years ago, a loss so profound it had hollowed him out, leaving a man who functioned but did not feel. He had walled off the grief, walled off the world. And this quiet woman, with her gentle hands and haunted eyes, had walked through those walls as if they were nothing but mist. Her leaving was not a trouble to be avoided. It was a wound, fresh and deep. He could let her go and retreat back into his fortress of solitude, or he could tear the whole thing down and go after her. His choice was clear. But he did not ride out immediately. First, he rode into town. Albright was taking breakfast at the boarding house, holding court with a few of the town's more impressionable merchants. Sullivan walked in, his spurs ringing on the wooden floor. The room fell silent. Albright. Sullivan's voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. Your business and promise is concluded. Albright dabbed his lips with a napkin, an arrogant smirk on his face. Is that so? Has the girl come to her senses? Corinne is not your concern, Sullivan said, stepping closer. Every man in the room could feel the danger radiating from him. It was not the hot anger of a brawler, but the cold, deadly focus of a man pushed past his limit. She is under my protection. What was between you is over. You will get in your buggy, you will drive east, and you will not stop until this territory is a memory. If I ever see your face in this valley again, you will not leave it standing. It was a declaration, made in front of the very people who had been whispering about Corinne. He was drawing a line in the dust, not with a gun, but with his word, his reputation. He was choosing her, publicly and irrevocably, over the town's opinion, over safety, over everything. Mrs. Gable watched from the kitchen doorway, her mouth agape. Sullivan turned, his gaze sweeping over the silent room, and walked out. He rode hard, tracking her footprints in the dust of the road. He knew she would not have gotten far on foot. He also knew Albright was not a man to be thwarted so easily. A man like that would not simply leave. He would try to take what he believed was his. Corinne had left the main road, cutting across the rough country. She knew from her time on the ranch that a small, unused line shack stood in a box canyon a few miles north. She could rest there for a day, gather her strength before moving on. She was not a helpless victim running blindly. She was using the knowledge she had gained to survive. She reached the canyon just as she heard the sound of horses behind her. It was Albright and 2 hired men he'd brought with him. Her heart leaped into her throat, but panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She scrambled into the narrow canyon entrance, the rock walls rising steeply on either side. It was a trap, but it was also defensible. She found the old line shack and barred the door, her mind racing. Corinne, there is nowhere left to run. Albright's voice echoed off the canyon walls. Come out, and I will be lenient. She remained silent, pressing her back against the rough wood of the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The 2 men with Albright dismounted, preparing to break down the door. This was it. The end of her flight. Then another rider appeared at the mouth of the canyon, silhouetted against the bright morning sun. It was Sullivan. He rode not at a charge, but at a slow, deliberate walk, his rifle resting easy across his saddle. That's far enough, Sullivan's voice boomed, deeper and more powerful than Albright's. Albright spun around, his face contorted with rage. This does not concern you, Cowboy. I made it my concern, Sullivan said, swinging down from his horse. He stood between them and the shack, a solid, immovable object. The lady does not wish for your company. The 2 hired men looked from Albright to Sullivan. They were paid thugs, not fools. They knew the look of a man like Sullivan. They knew what he was capable of. They hesitated. Inside the shack, Corinne heard his voice. He had come for her, not because she was helpless, but because he could not live without her. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. She had tried to save him from her trouble, but in doing so, she had shown him what his life would be without her. In that moment, her fear dissolved, replaced by a fierce, protective courage. She would not hide behind this door and let him fight for her. This was her battle, too. She unbarred the door and stepped out into the sunlight, blinking. She stood on the shack's small porch, her head held high. He is right, Arthur, she said, her voice clear and strong, echoing in the narrow canyon. I will not be going with you. Not now, not ever. She looked past him, at the 2 men he had hired. The man you are working for is a coward. He tried to force a marriage on me to settle my father's debts. He sees people as property to be bought and sold? Is that the kind of man you risk your lives for? Her quiet dignity, her refusal to be cowed, did more damage than any weapon could have. The hired men shifted uncomfortably. They had signed on to retrieve a runaway woman, not to be part of a war with a man like Sullivan over a matter of honor. One of them shook his head and stepped back toward his horse. The other followed suit. Albright was left alone, sputtering with impotent rage. He looked from Corinne's defiant face to Sullivan's unyielding one. He was beaten, not by force, but by a truth he could not bully into submission. With a final venomous glare, he mounted his horse and rode away, defeated. Silence descended on the canyon, broken only by the whisper of the wind. Corinne and Sullivan stood looking at each other across the dusty space. The danger was past. The threat was gone, and all that was left was the vast unspoken thing between them. He walked toward her, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked up at her, his stormy eyes raw with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I thought I'd lost you," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "You found me," she whispered. He saved her from Albright, but she, by leaving, had saved him from himself. She had forced him to break down his own walls, to step out of the lonely fortress of his grief and declare himself to the world. Their rescue was mutual. The ride back to the Triple Creek was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not the tense, watchful silence of before, but a deep, settled peace. The space between them was no longer filled with questions and uncertainty, but with a profound and comforting sense of inevitability. When they arrived, the ranch hands watched them ride in together. They saw the way he looked at her, the way she sat her horse with a newfound confidence. They saw that something fundamental had shifted. The foreman, a grizzled man named Moss, tipped his hat to her as she dismounted. It was a small gesture, but it was a sign of acceptance. She was no longer just the woman who worked with the horses. She was part of the Triple Creek. Sullivan led her not to her cabin, but to the front porch of the main house. They stood there as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. He took her hand, the one that had once borne a ring. He turned it over, his thumb tracing the faint, pale line that was almost gone now. He did not have another ring to offer her. He had something more real. "I've been alone a long time, Corinne," he said, his voice low and steady. "I thought that's how it was supposed to be. I was wrong." He met her eyes, his gaze direct and full of a vulnerable hope that made her heart ache. "This is your home now, if you'll have it." It was not a flowery proposal. It was a statement of fact, a simple, profound truth. He was not offering her a new life to replace her old one. He was offering her a place to build one, together. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of relief, of a bone-deep sense of belonging that she had never known. "I'll have it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He did not kiss her then. He simply held her hand, lacing his strong, calloused fingers through hers. They stood together on the porch, watching the last of the light fade from the sky as the first stars began to appear. The vast, empty wilderness that had once seemed so terrifying now felt like a promise, a future stretching out before them, wide and open and full of hope. The frontier was still a wild and dangerous place, but she was no longer alone in it. She had found her shelter, not in a place, but in a person. And as Sullivan's hand tightened around hers, Corinne knew, with absolute certainty, that she was finally, truly, home. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the greatest risks lead to the most beautiful destinations, and that true strength is often found in the quiet courage to start over. If you were moved by Corinne and Sullivan's journey, please give this video a like, subscribe to our channel, and ring the bell so you never miss a new story from the heart of the West. We have to ask, what would you have done if you were in Corinne's shoes that day at the station? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We believe that everyone deserves a place to call home, and we thank you for finding a small one here with us.